Jen, do you remember when we were in LA and we went to go look for whales?
You know what I remember? We were looking at all the boats and we were like, oh, thank God it's going to be a big boat. We had wine and then we just see the little dinghy and we're like, oh,
And then we just put the wine away. I'm gonna need my full attention in order to hold on to this dinghy so we don't fall out. I remember as we went along, there was like a bunch of, I mean, obviously whales and dolphins and whatever, but then we saw sea lions, I think.
oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, this is like a super rare pull, but we did manage to see some seagulls, so that was pretty cool. Every time I go on vacation, I always try to go out and explore on the ocean and be on boats and go and see whatever fish I can. A place I've always wanted to go to is New Zealand. But in New Zealand, especially back in the Maritimes history, it was really dangerous to go to, particularly this one area called the Auckland Islands. It is approximately 285 to 290 miles south of New Zealand, and it is one of the most hostile terrestrial environments ever documented as far as it goes for maritime histories. The reason why it's so dangerous is because it has the remnants of two massive active volcanoes. The islands are defined by a bunch of volcanic cliffs, impenetrable forests, and acidic bogs. So it's really just, it's not giving. It's not giving island vacation. You don't really want to go here. But for mariners of the 19th century, these islands were essentially just a period in their way to getting to New Zealand or other places. It was purgatory if you went there. These particular places were subject to freezing rain, snow, gale force winds for an average of 300 days per year. And considering there's only 365 days in the year, it was just not a good place to be. In 1864, this desolate place became the stage for a shipwreck in which there would be a pretty big social experiment unintentionally. It was between an Australian schooner, the Grafton, and the Scottish square rigger, Invercauld. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And they wrecked on opposite ends of this island within 4 miles of each other. And we're going to get into that today. Everything we say in our podcast is something that we've gathered from trustful sources on the internet. So keep that in mind. It is from the internet. We do try to find our most accurate information, but if there's anything we got wrong, you're more than welcome to point out in the comments or just start a discussion down there. We love to hear your thoughts. We also have down in the description a Google form if you have case suggestions that you would like us to cover. On this podcast, we cover true crime and true events. So if you like that, please subscribe. And without further ado, we're just going to get into it. So, a little bit more about this island and how it was formed and what the kind of environment these marooners now found themselves in. It was dominated primarily within the remains of the southern volcano and like the little crater there, which today forms a harbor. The northern end of the island is very rugged, featuring cliffs that abruptly rise from the ocean, exceeding heights of 2,000 feet. Between these 2 points lies a terrain so treacherous that movement across the island was nearly impossible for these castaways, especially considering they just found themselves marooned. They'd have no climbing gear, no tools, and no way to get through this heavy forested area. The climate also was particularly suboptimal, I'm going to say. The temperatures rarely rose beyond 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's pretty cold in Celsius. Even in the summer, it would frequently drop towards freezing. The soil was particularly barren, and even if these people could, they wouldn't really be able to make crops. And they were totally relying on the local fauna. Their primary food sources during this time were sea lions, seagulls, and occasionally shellfish like mussels found in the tidal zones. when they could get to the tide, of course. The biological reality of the island meant that any group of survivors had to become adept hunting tiger seals. Leopard spotted females and aggressive bulls were frequented on these beaches. And I don't know if you've ever seen the videos, especially like Happy Feet, or there's another fucking penguin show. Anyways, these leopard spotted seals are particularly very dangerous, and they're just, they're being protective. They will bite and hurt you. These animals, when they were able to hunt them, provided not only protein, but oil for their lamps and hide for clothing and footwear. As these people were here for a little bit more about the ships. So the Grafton was a 56-ton schooner, not a gooner, and it was not a traditional trading vessel, but the center of a speculative venture, which was founded by Sydney-based traders. The voyage was prompted by rumors of tin deposits on Campbell Island and the prospect of seal populations for oil and skins. So they were pretty experts in the way of seal hunting. Captain Thomas Musgrave, an Englishman by birth with a reputation for being very meticulous as far as his moral character and navigation was concerned, he was in command. Accompanying him was Francois Reynal, hopefully I pronounced that right, a Frenchman whose life had been shaped by the hardships of the Australian goldfields and was a representative for the backers for this whole expedition. Among the crew, there was a high caliber of talent, not only through their technical skill, but also through their social skills. There was Alexander McLaren, a Norwegian seaman who provided decades of maritime experience and was a proficient swimmer, which would come in handy. George Harris, who is a 20-year-old Englishman. Henry Forges, who was a Portuguese cook who recently survived a javelin injury and leprosy in Samoa. Samoa? I hope I pronounced that right. Who rounded out the party. So they had just spent a month of fruitless searching on Campbell Island for tin deposits and for seals, but the search was not good. So they were sailing towards the Auckland Islands on December 29th of 1863, and they entered the harbor on January 1st of 1864 to seek refuge from a developing storm. The wreck occurred on the night of January 3rd. A ferocious gale caused one anchor of the chain to snap, and the second one dragged across the rocky bottom. The vessel was driven into the beach at the southern end of the harbor, where the keel was eventually torn from the hull by the rising tide and the pounding surf, because these beaches were very, very rocky. And despite the violence of the impact, the ship remained upright and intact, allowing the crew to do a salvage operation. Alexander swam to shore with a line, establishing a pulley system that enabled the crew to transport essential supplies, such as their navigational instruments, a double-barreled rifle, flour, and most importantly, tea. While that was happening, on the other side of the island, the Invercauld survivors would later huddle in inadequate shacks. The Grafton immediately prioritized the construction of permanent, defensible dwelling. While they initially resided in tents made from the salvaged sails, they soon realized that the subarctic winter was about to hit and they needed more robust protection. They built it using the Grafton's timbers and the wood harvested from the surrounding forest. The men produced their own lime mortar by burning seashells to construct a stone fireplace and chimney. The interior was meticulously organized, featuring a loft for storing cords and sails, individual sleeping cots for each man, and a chest that served as a communal desk. Archaeological surveys conducted in 2002 and 2003 identified the foundation stones and the remaining upright posts fashioned from the schooner's mast, confirming that they were pretty sophisticated as described in the journals that they later found. The maintenance of the hut was the larger part of their strategy to continue to survive. Because if you're chilling in a place for a long time and you don't see your friends or family, or a way of surviving, or generally just a way of getting out of that situation, you're not going to feel so good. So, being able to keep up with the cleaning and civilized habits that you would have back home, it made you feel a little bit better. Particularly, they were able to manufacture soap, and they would do these things called boat runs where they would clear a path to the sea, which made for easier launching their smaller craft for hunting and exploration. And they would kind of do this on a daily schedule. There would be some people who would be, cleaning the house. There'd be other people who would be making soap or doing mortar stuff. They would just keep themselves busy. And that was the most important part. The most critical factor as far as survival went was the conscious decision to reject tyranny in the favor of a democratic system. And this is not me pushing a political agenda, it's just what worked for them. Early in their stay, Captain Thomas and Francois recognized that there was a lack of governance that would lead to animosity. So they held an election in which Captain Thomas was voted chief, not by right of his former rank, but by what the people voted. The rules of this group were inscribed on a page of his Bible and read aloud every Sunday after prayers. These Bible rules codified that the rules and responsibilities of each man, ensuring that the labor was equally distributed and that disputes were resolved through their predetermined system of mediation. So they would have these beautiful systems of educational engagement where they would do reading and writing classes and language exchange. On Sunday, they would do Sunday prayers, Bible study, and poetry reading. They would also try to manufacture games like cards, chess, or dominoes. So Captain Thomas utilized the evenings to teach the illiterate members how to read and write. When their ink was exhausted, they resorted to using the blood of the seals to continue their lessons and maintain the ship's log because they were very meticulous in this ship's log. Meanwhile, Francois crafted a set of cards, dominoes, and chess to provide entertainment during the long winter nights. These activities prevented the men from succumbing to just being like, oh my God, it's another day of chores. Oh my God, it's another day of doing a boat run. Like, it was just a little bit of fun to have. By the end of 1864, after 12 months of being on the island without a single vessel in sight, the crew realized that no rescue expedition would be dispatched from Sydney. Honestly, props to them for waiting a whole year before going, yeah, I don't think anyone's coming. Like, they were very confident someone would come for them. And it just shows how great leadership system was for them to go like a whole year without totally murdering each other. So they reached a decision that they needed to build their own escape using the remains of the Eagleton. It was very ambitious to try to put together the ship again. The first hurdle was primarily their lack of tools. The crew possessed only a hammer, a worn axe, an auger, and a dies to manufacture bolts, nails, everything that you would need to build a boat. Francois had to first build a forge. He constructed a furnace from stone and brick with a roof fashioned from copper sheets salvaged from the Grafton's hull. The most complex component was the bellows, which Francois manufactured from wood and seal skins, working far into the night to perfect the mechanism. The men harvested wood and cleared the forest to make charcoal pits, providing the fuel was necessary to fire the furnace. Over several months, the forge produced over 700 nails and numerous bolts fashioned from salvaged iron, a specialized set of woodworking tools, including chisels and scrapers, and repairs to the metal fittings of their small boat. While the group initially tried to build an entirely new vessel, they were thwarted by the lack of a large drill bit necessary to hold together heavy timbers. So, like, this is more than just like strapping a couple of logs together and saying, yep, let's go. Like, they were trying to build a proper fucking boat. So, they pivoted and modified it to turn more into a dinghy, much like we have ridden before. They added a false keel to improve stability in heavy seas. They decked the entire boat over to make it waterproof, and this modified craft, named the Rescue, was 17 feet long and 6 feet wide. A tiny vessel for the 240-mile crossing of the Southern Ocean. As the Grafton crew began finalizing the construction, a second catastrophe was unfolding on the northern end of the island. So, the Iverclad, a 1,100-ton Scottish vessel, was driven into the cliffs by an autumn storm. Unlike the gradual grounding of the Grafton, the Iverclad was destroyed almost instantly by the power of the surf against the 2,000-foot vertical rock faces. Of the 25 men aboard, 19 managed to struggle their way into a small cove. They reached an extreme state of distress. Many of the men were injured, most were without shoes, and they possessed almost no supplies beyond a few pounds of salted pork and biscuits. The survivors, the ship's captain, George Daljarno, Jesus, the first mate, Andrew Smith, and second mate, James Mahoney. I really hope I'm pronouncing. Like, most of the time in these cases, we're like covering like Japanese or like Spanish. These are just English names that I can't pronounce. The immediate aftermath of the Ironclad wreck was marked by a complete failure of command. George was described as despondent and ineffective. He failed to issue orders to salvage materials from the ship while it was still visible in the surf. The men were huddled in a poorly constructed, cramped shelter on the beach, suffering from exposure as the winter set in. In contrast, when you look at the two groups, there's Captain Thomas and Captain George. And while Thomas integrated his crew into a democratic community, George attempted to maintain a rigid traditional hierarchy, which was pretty obsolete in the grand scheme of things. He demanded that lower ranking crew continue to serve the officers, burning their precious caloric reserves to fetch water and food for the leadership while receiving no protection or plan in return. The imbalance quickly led to every man for himself without a goal or sense of responsibility. It pretty quickly descended into a Lord of the Flies situation, with every man just going to violence and not considering each other like human. So by the end of May, the Iverclad survivors had dwindled from 19 to 10. The survivors eventually discovered a row of berry bushes, which led them across the cliff to Fort Ross and the remains of a settlement, which was a failed colonial village abandoned in 1854. Here they found the ruins of several houses as well as abandoned tools and scrap metal. Remarkably, despite possessing better resources than the Grafton crew, the Iverclad survivors failed to use them, and they believed that the presence of the village was the sign that there was going to be rescue. And they spent their days just kind of chilling and reinforcing structures, sometimes getting some berries to eat. Like, they were like convinced it's not that deep. Captain George was pretty absent, and he even abandoned his injured second mate, James, leaving him to starve to death in one of the ruined houses. If you're looking at the two, his rafting crew survived a whole year. No one died. And they were all just working together versus Iverclad crew, who, initially had 19 people, but within the first month, they had 10 people die. So just great. Despite the desperation of the survivors from the Iverclad shipwreck, something good would come out of it, which was Robert Holding. He was a 23-year-old seaman who would eventually emerge as the leader, and he recorded the horrific details of their decline. In the ruins of the settlement, as the men died one by one from cold or malnutrition or just being abandoned when they're injured, instances of theft and physical conflict became rampant. One of the most documented episodes involved Fitz Howser and William Hervey. Following a dispute in their primitive stick shelter, Harvey threw Fritz out into a freezing winter night. Fritz was found dead the next morning. Several days later, it was discovered that William Harvey, he went by Harvey, it was discovered that he was eating parts of his body to survive. As the winter progressed, the number of survivors continued to fall. By this time, they had been on the island for 12 months, and only 3 survived: Captain George, First Mate Andrew, and Robert. It was only through Robert's resourceful and tireless efforts in foraging and maintaining their meager shelter that even these three survived. Robert had essentially taken command of his useless officers, which was a deadnap that would lead to something later further on. So keep that in mind. However, the Grafton crew had completed the modifications to their dinghy. On June 19th of 1865, George Francois and Alec McLaren prepared to set sail for New Zealand. The boat was too small to carry all five men safely across the turbulent Southern Ocean, so George Harris and Henry Forges volunteered to stay behind. The 240-mile voyage to Stewart Island was a feat of navigation and endurance that was pretty terrifying for these three guys. For 5 days, the tiny craft was battered by a hurricane. Thomas's journal entry from September 7th during a subsequent trip captured the terror of one of those nights. And this is from his book. If one of the high seas that are coming round her in every direction falls aboard, she is gone. It would knock her into 10,000 pieces. So it just wasn't good, is what he was saying. Despite the odds, Thomas's navigation was flawless. On July 23rd, they sighted Stewart Island, and on July 24th, they entered Adventure, which they had just completed their own little adventure. The appearance of these three emaciated, long-haired men in a tiny little dinghy created a sensation in New Zealand. Thomas immediately began a public fundraising campaign in order to finance a rescue mission for Harris and Forges, because they wouldn't apparently just go rescue him. He chartered a vessel called the Flying Scald, captained by a man named Cross, and he insisted on returning to the islands himself to help guide the search. What a fucking guy. The survivors were reaching New Zealand. The three remaining Invercauld survivors were rescued by a fortuitous occurrence. On May 20th, 1865, a Portuguese ship, Julian, had entered Fort Ross to repair a leak and spotted George, James, and Henry Golding. They were taken to Peru. As a final act of betrayal, however, once aboard the Julian, George and James reinstated their officer roles and were provided quarters within the officers' mess, while Holding was forced to go into the lower decks. Officers reportedly ordered Holding not to reveal that he had been the key to their survival. Upon reaching South America, Holding was left behind by his officers and had to secure his own fucking way home through the way of charity. Meanwhile, Thomas's rescue mission aboard the Flying Scald arrived in Auckland Island in late August of 1865. After a joyous meeting, Thomas insisted on searching the rest of the island for other castaways, having seen what he thought was smoke on the eastern coast. This search led them to Port Ross and the ruins of Enderby settlement. Inside one of the abandoned houses, they discovered the body of a man who had evidently died of starvation. This was the body of the second mate, James Mahoney. Beside the body lie a Rubing slate with hieroglyphical zigzags, which was scratched into his surface, a final desperate message that was undecipherable. Thomas could only identify the name James. This discovery proved the first clue to the parallel tragedy that had just unfolded 20 miles from their own successful settlement. So, with the return of the Grafton survivors and the harrowing details of the Invercauld wreck, it was pretty big shift in the maritime policy as far as the South Pacific goes. The news sparked public concern in New Zealand and Australia about the vulnerability of ships in these waters, which led to the establishment of castaway depots. The New Zealand government began a 64-year program provisioning remote islands with deposits of food, tools, clothing, and blankets. There were regular patrols looking for survivors, and there were also advancements made. Captain Thomas's meticulous observations and charting during his 20 months on the island were presented to the Victorian government and made significant contributions towards maritime science. And of course, the story left a mark behind on the society and literature. Francois went on to write an international bestseller called Wrecked on a Reef. No tea, no shade, but it was widely cited as the primary inspiration for another novel called The Mysterious Island, which was written in 1874. His characters, particularly the engineer Cyrus Smith, embodied the ingenuity and social kind of moral compass that allowed Grafton 5 to survive while the 19 others perished on the same island. And that's where we're kind of at with today's case. The success of the Grafton crew was not really a product of luck. It was a product of just people coming together and them having the skills and creativity to make their own way to get off this island versus the other crew, which just assumed that they would get rescued and there was really no point in survival. But yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Always looking forward to hearing it. I thought this one would just be a nice, quote unquote, reprieve from some of our darker cases that we've been covering lately. But yeah, we'll see you in the next episode.